At Father's Day brunch, he raised his coffee and said, "I'm proud of every one of my children, except the disappointment sitting right here." Chuckles echoed around the table. I stood up, set a small silver envelope in front of him, and said, "Happy Father's Day, Dad." Then I walked outside and repossessed the motorcycle I had gifted him. Minutes later, I heard him gasp. He had finally opened the envelope. I, 28M, had been planning this moment for 3 years, ever since Dad made it crystal clear where I stood in his hierarchy of children. The silver envelope in my jacket pocket felt heavier than it should have as I walked into the restaurant that Father's Day morning. The family was already gathered around the large corner table when I arrived. My older brother sat to Dad's right, fresh off his latest promotion at the law firm. My sister beamed from across the table, her medical residency acceptance letter probably still warm in her purse from showing it off earlier. Then there was me, the family disappointment, who dropped out of engineering school to start what Dad called that ridiculous towing business. Dad barely glanced up when I took the empty seat at the far end of the table. The conversation flowed around me like I was invisible, filled with updates about my siblings' achievements and Dad's obvious pride in their accomplishments. I picked at my eggs Benedict and waited. The moment came when Dad stood up, coffee cup raised high, that familiar gleam in his eyes that meant he was about to deliver one of his speeches. The table fell silent as he cleared his throat dramatically. He began talking about how proud he was of his children, how they had exceeded every expectation he'd ever had. His voice carried that warm, paternal tone that I remembered from childhood, back when I thought I might someday be worthy of it too. He praised my brother's legal mind, my sister's dedication to healing others, and then his eyes found mine. The pause stretched uncomfortably long before he continued, explaining how proud he was of every one of his children, except for the disappointment sitting right here. The chuckles that followed felt like physical blows. My brother tried to hide his smirk behind his napkin. My sister looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Mom just stared at her plate. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. Every eye at the table followed me as I reached into my jacket and pulled out the small silver envelope I'd been carrying. I placed it carefully in front of Dad's coffee cup and told him Happy Father's Day. Then I turned and walked toward the exit. The morning air hit my face as I stepped outside, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete calm. I pulled out my phone and made a quick call to my business partner, confirming that the tow truck was in position around the corner. Then I walked to where Dad's motorcycle sat gleaming in the parking lot. The 2019 Harley-Davidson Road King had been my gift to him 2 years ago, back when I still believed his approval was something I could earn. I'd saved for months, working 18-hour days to afford it. The look on his face when I presented it had been worth every sacrifice, or so I'd thought at the time. Now, as I attached the tow cables with practiced efficiency, I remembered how quickly that gratitude had faded. Within weeks, he was back to his usual comments about my life choices, my business, my failure to live up to the family standards. The motorcycle became just another thing he owned, another symbol of his success that he could show off to his friends. The tow truck driver gave me a thumbs up as we loaded the bike. I handed him the spare key I'd kept and the paperwork proving the motorcycle was still registered in my name, a detail Dad had never bothered to change. The irony wasn't lost on me that his lawyer's son had never thought to check the legal ownership of the gift. Through the restaurant window, I could see Dad still holding the unopened envelope, probably wondering what kind of sentimental card his disappointment of a son had left him. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. My phone buzzed with a text from my business partner. The timing was perfect. I walked back toward the restaurant entrance just as the sound of the tow truck's engine faded into traffic. Inside, the family was still seated around the table, but the atmosphere had shifted. Dad was staring at the envelope like it might explode. Mom kept glancing toward the door, probably wondering where I'd gone. My siblings looked confused, but were trying to restart their conversation about summer vacation plans. I didn't go back inside. Instead, I waited in my truck across the parking lot, watching through the window as Dad finally opened the envelope. Even from a distance, I could see his face change. The color drained from his cheeks as he pulled out the contents. Not a greeting card, but a legal document. Specifically, the title transfer papers for the motorcycle, along with a receipt showing that the loan he'd co-signed for my business had been paid in full 3 months early. The second document was even better. It was a copy of the contract I'd signed the previous week, selling my towing company to a larger firm for a sum that would make my lawyer brother's salary look modest. The deal had been in the works for months, but I kept it quiet, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Dad's hands were shaking as he read. I watched him show the papers to my brother, whose expression shifted from confusion to something that looked suspiciously like respect. My sister leaned over to read, her mouth falling open. Mom just looked proud, and I realized she'd probably known about my success all along. The third document was the real kicker, a copy of my acceptance letter to the graduate business program at the state university, along with a scholarship award that covered full tuition. I'd been working toward my MBA for 2 years, taking night classes while running my business. Dad had no idea because he'd never bothered to ask what I was doing with my life beyond his initial dismissal of my choices. I started my truck and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving my family to process what they'd just learned. My phone started ringing before I'd gone 2 blocks, Dad's number flashing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was everything I'd hoped it would be. Dad's voice was strained as he tried to explain that his comment had been a joke, that he'd always been proud of me, that he wanted to talk. He mentioned the motorcycle, asking if there had been some kind of mistake with the tow truck. The desperation in his voice was almost enough to make me feel guilty. Almost. Update 1. The calls didn't stop. Over the next week, I received dozens of messages from various family members. My brother, surprisingly, was the first to reach out with something resembling an apology. He admitted that Dad's comment had been out of line and that he should have said something. My sister called to congratulate me on the business sale and asked why I'd never told anyone about going back to school. Mom was different. When she finally got through to me, she didn't apologize for Dad or make excuses. Instead, she told me she was proud of what I'd accomplished and sorry that it had taken such a dramatic gesture for the family to pay attention. She'd known about my success because she'd been quietly following my business's growth in the local papers. She'd kept my secret about school because I'd asked her to, but she'd been bursting with pride the whole time. Dad's messages grew more desperate as the week progressed. He wanted to meet, to talk, to explain himself. He offered to buy the motorcycle back, not understanding that it wasn't about the money. He promised to make things right, to treat me with the respect I deserved. I finally agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where he couldn't make a scene. He looked older when he walked in, more fragile somehow. The confident man who'd humiliated me at brunch had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely shaken. He started with apologies, explaining that his comment had been meant as a joke, that he'd never intended to hurt me. He talked about how proud he was of my success, how he'd always known I had potential. The words felt hollow after years of dismissal and criticism. I let him talk for a while before I responded. I told him that his comment at brunch hadn't been a joke. It had been his honest opinion, and we both knew it. I explained that I hadn't repossessed the motorcycle out of spite, but because I was tired of my gifts being taken for granted by someone who saw me as a failure. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Dad tried to justify his behavior, claiming he'd been trying to motivate me, that he'd thought tough love would push me to succeed. I pointed out that I had succeeded, despite his lack of support, not because of it. Update 2. 3 months later, our family dynamic had shifted completely. Dad made an effort to include me in conversations, to ask about my business and my studies. It felt forced at first, like he was checking boxes on a list of how to be a better father, but gradually, it became more natural. My brother and I developed an unexpected friendship. He admitted that he'd always felt pressure to be the perfect son and that watching me break free from Dad's expectations had been liberating for him too. My sister started asking for business advice, considering leaving medicine to pursue her own entrepreneurial dreams. The motorcycle situation resolved itself in an unexpected way. Dad never asked for it back, and after a few months, I decided to return it, not as a gift, but as a loan. I told him he could use it as long as he treated me with respect. If he ever made another comment like the one at Father's Day brunch, the bike would disappear again, permanently this time. He agreed to the terms, and I could see in his eyes that he understood this wasn't really about the motorcycle. It was about respect, about recognizing that his approval wasn't something I needed anymore, but his basic human decency was something I deserved. The graduate program was everything I'd hoped it would be. My professors were impressed with my real-world business experience, and several classmates sought me out for advice on their own ventures. I was no longer the family disappointment. I was the family entrepreneur, the one who'd taken risks and succeeded on his own terms. Update 3. A year after that Father's Day, we gathered again for the same celebration. The atmosphere was completely different this time. Dad's speech was shorter, more genuine, and when he talked about being proud of his children, his eyes lingered on me with what looked like actual pride, not obligation. After brunch, he pulled me aside and thanked me for the wake-up call. He admitted that he'd been so focused on traditional measures of success that he'd missed what I was actually accomplishing. He'd spent the year thinking about his own father, who'd been similarly dismissive, and realized he'd been perpetuating a cycle of criticism that needed to end. I graduated with my MBA that spring, and Dad was in the front row at the ceremony. The business sale had funded not just my education, but also the down payment on a house and the startup capital for my next venture. I was consulting for small businesses now, helping other entrepreneurs avoid the mistakes I'd made and capitalize on opportunities I'd learned to recognize. The silver envelope had contained more than just documents. It had held years of suppressed anger, disappointment, and hurt. But it had also held proof that I didn't need his approval to succeed, that I'd been building a life worth being proud of all along. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's success that speaks so loudly it drowns out every criticism that came before it. Dad learned that lesson the hard way, but he learned it. And sometimes, that's enough. The motorcycle still sits in his garage, a reminder of the day our relationship changed forever. He takes better care of it now, and every time he rides it, I think he remembers that respect is something you earn, not something you're entitled to just because you're family.